So I'm currently at the 6th Tiger Conference with Galeotti, senior researcher at the Institute of International Relations of Prague. Thank you for joining us. We just assisted to this panel about security, which is a wide problem, I would say, in Ukraine. And there has been this theme raised up of the idea that the Minsk Agreement is a, quote, stillborn agreement. Can you expand on this?
Well, let's be honest. I mean, the problem with the Minsk Agreement is that it presupposes that both sides are actually committed to it, whereas it's clear that Moscow, from the first, has just simply regarded this as part of its so-called lawfare, part of its sort of campaign against Ukraine. And let's be also honest that everyone knew that from the first. It was just that when you get a bunch of very powerful people together at an event, they felt they had to leave with something, and this was something. And frankly, they pushed Ukraine to sign. And now that it's there, even though we know that this is not going anywhere, that there's no question that the Russians are going to relinquish control, for example, of the border, but nonetheless, we have to pretend and genuflect that Minsk exists. And so long as it's there, it blocks the space for any proper, real agreement that could possibly be negotiated.
So what would be the solution then?
Well, look, I don't think it's for Kiev to simply on its own abrogate the agreement, because then it would look like it was the bad person. Really, I think Europe got Ukraine in this mess. It's Europe's job to get it out of this mess. I think actually what I would like to see, and unfortunately I don't think we're going to see this for a while, but actually is Europe beginning to acknowledge that the Minsk Agreement is not going anywhere, and for it to make the initiative and say no. We either Russia has to demonstrate within a very, very specific time frame a much clearer awareness of its need to meet the terms, or else we declare this agreement dead.
So it is widely considered that Ukraine is a strategic point between, well, the West and the East conflicts, let's put it that way. Would you say it's still a strategic point? As we saw, the Trump administration doesn't really care about Ukraine anymore. Would you say that Ukraine is still as important as it used to be?
Well, look, I mean, one could say that, frankly, it's hard to know who the Trump administration cares about. In general terms, I mean, what we see is this is a conflict. It's not just about the future of Ukraine. That's clearly the primary element. It is also about Russia, or rather Putin's attempt to establish what he thinks of as Russia's place as a great power. And he's very much a traditional, frankly, a 19th century geopolitical strategist. He thinks a great power means that you're a country who no one gets to tell what to do, and above all has a sphere of influence, a sphere of countries whose sovereignty is secondary to your own. And Ukraine clearly falls within that, as Georgia and other post-Soviet states. So the question is, in some ways, if the West allows Putin to have his way with Ukraine, that is not just a tragedy for Ukraine, it also basically strikes at the very heart of the post-1945 world order, which said that every country has its own right to determine its own future. So it's not so much that I think it's a strategic point in terms of a struggle between Russia and America, or Russia and Europe, or whatever. I think it's a strategic point in a struggle over what kind of world will we have, and whether or not the old world order, based as it is around this idea of national equality, can survive.
When we talk about, and you talked about Georgia, we often talk about frozen conflict. It is not the case in Ukraine. How do you see this evolve in, let's say, the next 2-5 years?
I mean, one of the problems with this term frozen conflicts is precisely it implies that somehow it's totally sort of antiseptic and so forth. Even if we look at what's happening in the Georgian cases of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, I mean, there's still conflict. To be honest, I find it hard to see there being any likelihood for change in terms of the situation with the Donbass, so long as Putin is still in the Kremlin. We may see a slow cooling of the action on the line of contact. But I don't think we're going to see it actually settle, not least because a lot of the skirmishes that we see there are not because someone in Moscow decided something. They are because the thuggish local gangsters who make up many of the militias there, they are basically involved in making money, and what they do is they start a skirmish, they shoot off 20,000 rounds, 10,000 rounds of ammunition. They claim they shot off 20,000. When the supplies come from Rostov-on-Don or wherever, they just sell the extra 10,000 on the black market. So, I mean, I think there's an extent to which this is a conflict that has its own dynamics. But no, I think, unfortunately, Just as I don't think we're going to see any attempt by Russia seriously to expand the area under their control, nor do I think it's likely, unless there's some dramatic political change, that we're actually going to see a normalization of the situation.
There has been this important point which has been raised during the conference, which is recognizing these territories are as occupied or not. So some people in the panel don't want to, let's say, admit it's occupied. Why is this such a problem?
Well, I think really that reflects two things. One is, unfortunately, the Minsk agreements suggested that there was some kind of difference between what was happening in Crimea and what was happening in the Donbass. And in fact, we have to acknowledge, that, as was said at the panel, that the same is the case. In both cases, we have Russia asserting control over territory that, in terms of international law, is not Russian. But the second thing is in terms of Ukrainian domestic politics. Now, I'm not an expert in Ukrainian domestic politics, but I think it is clear that acknowledging these areas as being occupied in some quarters is almost taken as a sign of fatalism, of defeatism. Personally, I would say it's just simply acknowledging the realities that exist on the ground, and there's no harm in being a little bit realistic. But nonetheless, as I said, that's an issue which is going to have to play out within Ukrainian politics.
And talking about Ukrainian politics, you use this term, it's a moving battlefield. Can you expand on this?
Sure, look, the Russians, there's a lot that's said about Russian hybrid warfare and new ways of warfare. In fact, there's very little that's truly new, except just the instruments that they're using. The Russians use warfare as simply one tool of many to get other people to do things that they don't want to do. Now, sometimes the best way of doing that in the Russian mind is straightforward military force. However, when that doesn't work, and I think the Russians have realized that, one thing one must say about Ukraine is that the military has been reformed and modernized astonishingly effectively. I think much more quickly and much better than anyone really had anticipated, if only the same progress had been made generally. In that context, if Russia wanted to actually make substantial further military movement, it would be bloody, it would be very, very substantial in terms of the forces they'd have to commit and the casualties they would take. And I don't think there's any appetite for that at the moment. But of course, Moscow's not going to give up. So instead, what it is moving the battlefield from a military conflict to a political one. And we're seeing that essentially in its attempts to undermine Ukraine and undermine Ukraine's governance. We've seen a campaign of terrorist-style attacks taking place within Ukraine. We've seen increasing efforts to basically build connections with organized crime. There's quite strong connections between Ukrainian and Russian gangs. We have seen, obviously, their continuing use of corruption and economic instruments as a way of also building political influence. And generally speaking, what they want to do is, if not paralyze Ukraine, but at least create a situation in which there are large constituencies that are just so unhappy with the situation that Ukraine becomes effectively ungovernable. So that is their real aim. So this is what they've moved their conflict from the battlefield to the realm of politics and governance.
But talking about corruption, does Ukraine need Russia's destabilizing factor in corruption? Concerning corruption, it is something systemic. It is something which is inside Ukraine already. So how to fight it if not?
Look, the Russian, there's sometimes claims that, the Russians export corruption. They don't. Unfortunately, what they do is they exploit corruption that exists, and not just in Ukraine, but in many other countries. It is absolutely, unfortunately, a systemic problem. One of the legacies, the poisonous, toxic legacies of the Soviet era that hasn't yet been properly worked through. And there are no shortcuts. It is for Ukrainians to deal with this. And how do you do that? Again, it's just the basic things. We know it's good laws, good institutions to apply those laws that are not subject to the control of the authorities, which is clearly one of the current sort of political fault lines. But most importantly of all, a public that is actually willing to basically push their representatives, their government, to apply and maintain the application of those laws. It's only, it's those three things. And it's simple to say and very hard to apply, but it has to come from Ukraine. Outside countries, they can provide assistance, they can give advice as to what makes a good law, they can provide money for training anti-corruption officers and so forth. But when it comes down to it, this is Ukraine's own struggle, and it's up to Ukraine to decide. if it is genuinely willing to take this opportunity to build a different kind of Ukraine.
But Ukrainian civil society after Euromaidan has become quite strong. So there is obviously an unbalanced equilibrium between leaders, as you said, and civil society. You also talked about the Putinization, the danger of a Putinization of Ukraine. What's the main idea between these terms?
Well, essentially, if one looks at Putin's Russia, I mean, it is clear that although obviously Putin has this grand vision of himself as the savior of Russia and the person who makes Russia great again,
some would say.
Regatherer of the Russian lands and so forth, nonetheless, essentially this is an authoritarian kleptocracy, which has the forms, the pretense of being a democracy. They have elections, they have parliaments and so forth. Obviously none of that really matters. In practice, it's a corrupt collection of elite interests and individuals who steal as much as they can and keep the country in control. But they do so in the name of a strong Russia. That's, in a way, their legitimating myth. They basically say, look, we are making Russia into a different kind of country, therefore don't pay too much attention to exactly what we're doing.
Gangsters?
Yeah, precisely. Well, I mean, the issue with Ukraine, and as I said, I mean, I really would want to stress that I think this is still in the balance, this has not been decided, is precisely whether or not we have the sight of governments that are willing to do probably the most difficult thing for any government, which is to surrender power, to surrender financial opportunity in the name of the wider reform program, or whether it wraps itself in the flag, pulls on a military jacket and says, this is not the time. We're busy fighting a war. There's no way we can reform during a war, because particularly now that the war is about governance and politics more than anything else, ironically, the most effective way that Ukraine could build its own security is precisely by reforming. But that's at the expense of the interests of a lot of individuals. So I think this is the problem. You might say, when I talk about the Putinization, it's that temptation to use the excuses of a dangerous situation in order to allow you to persecute your political rivals, to maintain control over economic assets, to hold back on genuine reform. These are all temptations that we can see playing out at the moment.
And it would play in the hands of Putin, so it's sort of like smaller mirror of Russia.
It would play in the hands of Putin, particularly because he knows how to deal with corrupt governments. Corrupt Ukrainian governments, he has dealt with several of them perfectly well. But also, it would very much damage Ukraine's claim to the rest of the world that it is actually a victim of aggression that is trying to build something different. There already is, let's be honest about this, a certain degree of exasperation in Brussels, in other European capitals, and indeed amongst people who care in Washington. It wouldn't take too much, I feel, for that to tip over and people just to throw up their hands and say, look, the trouble with this Ukrainian struggle is, yes, of course, the Russians are the aggressors, but basically both sides are as bad as the other. And that would be terrible for Ukraine. It would also be wrong. So the important thing is to maintain the momentum, maintain a reform process that shows to the outside world that Ukraine definitely wants to be a European country.
And this is going to be my last question, as I did understood before the interview. You were here last year, and since last year, did you notice some changes, or
Sure. Yeah, I think again, what's interesting is we've seen this sort of widening of this gap between the military reform program, which, as I said, has been tremendously effective, and the political process, which is actually in some ways even more problematic. You mentioned before, for example, the really strong civil society that we've seen has flourished in Ukraine, and which is really encouraging. The problem is that is of very little political relevance if there are no instruments that connect civil society from below with politics above. And I think in this past year, if anything, we have seen the government actually almost trying to insulate itself from these kind of pressures, insulate itself from criticism. Not gone beyond the point of no return by any means, but nonetheless it is a slightly, from my point of view as a friend of Ukraine's, a worrying trajectory.
So, and how do you see Ukraine in 10 years? I know it's unpredictable, but how do you see it going?
I'm broadly optimistic for two reasons. One is because I'm optimistic about Ukraine, and ironically the other one because I'm optimistic about Russia. In terms of Ukraine, I think, look, yes, we have seen this perennial 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back reform process. But nonetheless, I mean, I definitely get the sense in both Kiev and elsewhere in the country that I think there are still enough people with optimism and enthusiasm who are going to continue to push, and whom the outside world, Europe and the United States, will continue to support and encourage. So, I mean, I think we will see, probably not as quick as one might like, but I think we will slowly see a degree of exasperation with the current status quo pushing for genuine reform. Second hand, look, obviously Russia is in a very different position, but actually the Donbass is exceedingly expensive for Russia. Not only is it expensive in terms of their domestic political opinion, because nobody wants their boys coming home from the Donbass. You know, ordinary Russians may well have felt Crimea was rightfully Krym nash, Crimea was ours. No one cares, frankly, about the Donbass. And the very fact that the Russians are still pretending there are no Russian troops there, look, it's not to convince us. We all know they're Russian troops. It's really just for their own domestic political audience. And also, Donbass is very expensive economically, because they're having to maintain the economy of this basically collapsed pseudo-states that are there. And thirdly, it's expensive in terms of Russia's international standing. Putin cannot pull back. Part of his self-image, but also part of his legitimating myth, is that he's a man who never makes mistakes. I mean, I've actually looked at it. I've tried to find him admit to a mistake, and I have not found evidence of that. So I think in the circumstances, because he's not going to be able to claim victory, I think that in some form or other they're going to stay there. But everyone is conscious of that. I mean, even when I talk to people in Moscow within the security establishment, they appreciate that Donbass was a mistake, a dangerous mistake. I think Putin is tired, and I think a lot of people are tired of Putin. I don't think he's going to be toppled, but I think he actually is looking for opportunities to hand power to a trusted successor. When we have that trusted successor, I don't think this person is going to be a Democrat, but I do think this person is going to be a pragmatic kleptocrat, who is going to need to improve relations with the West, who's going to need to basically buy off the population. And the Donbass is a relatively easy way. You blame it on Putin, and you push forward for some kind of thing. And let's face it, the West would love that. The West is conflict averse. It wants to improve relations. So probably, I mean, although I don't see Crimea moving, but in 10 years, I think we may well see no longer a Putin in the Kremlin and no longer Russian troops in the Donbass. So I think there are developments in both Moscow and Kiev, or rather Russia and Ukraine, which I think lend us that. Unfortunately, it's going to be a rough 10 years getting to that stage.
Well, thank you very much for this interview. It was a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure.